At 11:51 in the morning on August 9th, 2025, a Venezuelan Navy warship rammed a United States supply vessel in the Caribbean Sea. The collision killed 3 American workers, injured 14 others, and tore open both ships. No missiles were fired, no shots were exchanged, no war was declared. But orders clashed, warnings were ignored, and physics erased the space for diplomacy. When the metal stopped tearing and the water stopped rushing in, 2 governments would be forced to explain deaths that international law said should never have occurred. This is how it happened. The vessels and the mission. On one side was the motor vessel Liberty Bay, a United States-flagged offshore supply ship 112 feet long and built with reinforced steel for rough water operations. She carried 42 people that morning, 38 American oil rig workers rotating onto deep water platforms, plus 4 crew members. These weren't tourists. They were welders, engineers, crane operators, and maintenance specialists men, between 30 and 55, with years of offshore experience. They understood the risks of blowouts and equipment failures. They did not expect to become casualties of a maritime sovereignty dispute. The Liberty Bay had departed Port of Spain, Trinidad, at 5:30 that morning. Her cargo included drilling mud, spare parts, and food supplies destined for offshore platform Delta 7. Her course took her through international waters, 17 nautical miles north of the Venezuelan coastline, well beyond the 12-mile territorial limit recognized under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The ship's automatic identification system broadcast continuously: Liberty Bay, United States flag, supply vessel, lawful transit. For her captain and crew, this was a routine voyage they had completed dozens of times. On the other side was the Mariscal Sucre, a Venezuelan Navy patrol corvette, 176 feet long, equipped with surveillance radar, deck guns, and a reinforced bow. She carried 73 crew members and had been at sea for 11 consecutive days, conducting aggressive interdiction operations near Venezuela's claimed maritime zones. Recent weeks had been tense. Foreign vessels, mostly oil service ships, had been increasingly active near Venezuelan waters. Some served legitimate platforms. Others were suspected of supporting unauthorized drilling operations. Venezuelan authorities had grown less inclined to give anyone the benefit of doubt. 2 weeks earlier, the Mariscal Sucre had intercepted a Panamanian tanker in a 6-hour standoff that ended only when the company produced documentation. The incident reinforced the crew's belief that foreign vessels would only comply when forced. New orders from Fleet Command reflected this harder stance. Vessels operating within or near Venezuela's claimed exclusive economic zone were to be identified, challenged, and, if necessary, detained. Officers were told that sovereignty was not negotiable, and hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. When the Liberty Bay appeared on radar that morning, heading toward offshore infrastructure, Venezuela claimed was operating without authorization. The stage was set for confrontation. Both ships believed their presence was lawful. Both were certain the other would yield. Neither understood how rapidly momentum would override judgment. Before we go deeper, hit subscribe. These are the kinds of events the world forgets until they happen again. The confrontation. At 11:43 in the morning, the Mariscal Sucre altered course to intercept Liberty Bay. The Venezuelan captain reviewed the radar contact and consulted operational briefings warning of foreign support vessels moving equipment to disputed drilling sites. The American ship's course, nationality, and destination made compliance uncertain in his assessment. He directed his vessel toward intercept and ordered crew to prepare boarding equipment. At 11:45, the Liberty Bay transmitted on the international hailing frequency, identifying herself as a United States supply vessel engaged in lawful transit to an offshore platform. The captain requested the approaching warship state its intentions. The response came 30 seconds later, formal and hard. United States vessel Liberty Bay. This is Venezuelan Navy patrol boat Mariscal Sucre. You are operating in Venezuelan territorial waters without authorization. Reduce speed immediately and prepare for boarding inspection." The Liberty Bay's captain felt the first edge of real concern. His charts clearly showed his position in international waters, beyond any territorial claim. He replied calmly, stating his coordinates and affirming his right of innocent passage under international maritime law. The Venezuelan response was immediate. "Your position is disputed. Reduce speed now, or we will take enforcement action." The Liberty Bay's captain had spent 22 years at sea. He knew that stopping meant delay, inspection of proprietary equipment, and submission to authority he did not recognize as valid in this location. But refusing meant escalation with an armed warship. He chose to affirm his peaceful intent, restate his legal position, and request clarification of the basis for the boarding order. The reply came faster and sharper. "You are operating in disputed waters during heightened enforcement. Reduce speed immediately. Non-compliance will result in forced stop." On the Liberty Bay's bridge, the first mate looked at the captain. The unspoken question was clear. The captain made his decision. He would not stop, but he would adjust course to increase distance from the Venezuelan coast and demonstrate his intent to avoid confrontation. He ordered a heading change to the northeast and an increase in engine speed. He transmitted this new course to the Mariscal Sucre, describing it as de-escalation, while maintaining his right to continue. On the Mariscal Sucre, this maneuver was interpreted as evasion. The American vessel had been given a clear order and responded by attempting to flee. The Venezuelan captain's assessment hardened. This was not innocent passage. This was defiance. He ordered pursuit speed and a course to force compliance. If the American captain would not stop for words, he would stop for steel. The Liberty Bay's captain saw the warship accelerate and angle toward him. His experience told him this was becoming dangerous. He sounded 5 short blasts on the ship's horn, the international danger signal, and pushed his engines to maximum output. The Liberty Bay was not built for speed. She was built for load carrying and stability. Her engines could only incrementally increase velocity. The Mariscal Sucre, designed for pursuit, closed the gap faster than the supply vessel could widen it. For 3 minutes, both ships ran on converging courses. Radio transmissions became shorter and harder. Positions became threats. Neither captain would yield. The Venezuelan captain believed in his authority and his training. The American captain believed in international law and his right to passage. The geometry of their collision was being drawn by pride, policy, and physics. At 11:49, the Mariscal Sucre made her final course adjustment toward direct intercept. Her captain invoked a tactic familiar to Venezuelan naval officers: physical intervention against non-compliant vessels. The maneuver called for bringing the bow close alongside, making contact if necessary to demonstrate authority and force the target to stop. It was designed for fishing boats and small cargo vessels. It had never been calculated for a heavily built offshore supply ship with industrial-grade hull plating. The distance collapsed. 500 meters. 300. The Liberty Bay's collision alarm sounded automatically, a harsh electronic warning filling every compartment. Workers below looked up in confusion, then moved instinctively toward exits, not yet understanding what was coming. At 200 meters, the Mariscal Sucre's helmsman felt concern turn to alarm. The closure rate was too fast. The Liberty Bay was not slowing. At 150 meters, the Venezuelan captain ordered hard starboard rudder, attempting to swing away and pass alongside rather than strike directly. But momentum carried the warship forward even as her rudder turned. The maneuver began too late. On the Liberty Bay, the captain saw the turn and recognized it as insufficient. He ordered emergency reverse and hard port rudder, trying to swing his stern away and present a glancing angle. The Liberty Bay's propeller reversed, shuddering the vessel. Her bow began to turn, but she was too heavy, too close, and too slow. In the final 30 seconds, both ships were committed to paths neither could escape. Alarms screamed, orders were shouted, crew members braced. And the Caribbean Sea, indifferent to sovereignty and law, waited for impact. The collision. At 11 hours, 51 minutes, and 14 seconds, the Mariscal Sucre's reinforced bow struck the Liberty Bay's starboard side. The sound was immediate and brutal. A deep metallic shriek as hull plating buckled inward. Support beams twisted. Rivets sheared. The Venezuelan warship's bow penetrated approximately 3 meters above the waterline and continued downward, opening a jagged wound that exposed interior compartments to seawater and daylight. The Liberty Bay's galley was partially crushed. 2 berthing cabins collapsed entirely. Equipment storage became chaos as crates broke loose and shifted violently. For those in the path of impact, there was no warning, only sudden violence. James Torres, 41, a welder from Houston, was in his berthing space when the steel wall beside him ceased to exist. He died instantly. Michael Brennan, 37, a maintenance technician from Oklahoma, was crushed by cargo that broke free during the strike. He had no chance. David Chen, 44, an electrical engineer from California, was thrown against a bulkhead with enough force to fracture his skull. He lost consciousness immediately and died within minutes. 14 others sustained serious injuries, broken bones, lacerations from flying debris, crush injuries. 1 man suffered severe head trauma. 2 required emergency surgery for internal bleeding. Several would face months of physical therapy. The Liberty Bay listed immediately to starboard as the Caribbean poured into the breach. Automatic bilge pumps engaged, fighting the incoming water. Watertight doors slammed shut, activated by crew members who understood what the grinding impact meant. Emergency lighting flickered on as primary electrical systems failed in the damaged section. The Mariscal Sucre's bow structure crumpled backward from the collision. Her forward compartments flooded through stress cracks. What had been planned as controlled pressure had become an uncontrolled strike against a vessel built of industrial steel, and carrying weight the Venezuelan captain had not properly calculated. Both ships remained afloat, but 3 men were dead, and the assumption that this would end without bloodshed was shattered. The casualties and response. Aboard the Liberty Bay, chaos organized itself through training and instinct. The captain, bleeding from a gash above his eye, keyed the emergency frequency and transmitted a mayday with their position, nature of distress, and casualty count. The message went out on multiple channels: Coast Guard, company operations, international distress. Crew members began damage control. Portable pumps were dragged to flooded spaces. Wooden wedges and emergency patches were hammered into the hull breach to slow water ingress. Injured workers were moved to the mess deck, which became an improvised medical station. The ship carried no doctor. The most qualified person was a rig supervisor who had been a Navy corpsman 15 years prior. He worked methodically through the injured, checking airways, controlling bleeding with torn shirts and duct tape, immobilizing fractures with whatever materials were available. His hands were steady despite the ship's worsening list and the knowledge that real medical help was at least an hour away. On the Mariscal Sucre, realization arrived in stages. Initial reports focused on their own damage. Then came visual confirmation of the Liberty Bay's condition, the visible hull breach, the list, the figures moving urgently on deck. The shift from enforcement to rescue happened unevenly. The Venezuelan warship launched a rigid hull inflatable with 3 crew and medical supplies. They approached cautiously. The irony was not lost on anyone, the ship that caused the damage now offering aid. Venezuelan medics came aboard and were directed to the mess deck without ceremony. They worked alongside American crew, treating injuries their vessel had inflicted. The tension was palpable, but secondary to the bleeding and broken bones. 41 minutes after impact, a United States Coast Guard helicopter arrived, having diverted from a patrol 80 miles north. It circled once, then began coordinating evacuation of critical casualties. A rescue swimmer descended and began preparing patients for hoist extraction. A second helicopter arrived with a Coast Guard flight surgeon and additional equipment. The surgeon went straight to the mess deck, rapidly reassessed all patients, and began stabilizing the head trauma case for immediate evacuation. The crisis evolved from collision to rescue. But the question hung in the Caribbean air: how did this happen? The evidence? Investigation began before the injured reached hospitals. Maritime disaster allows no pause between consequence and accounting. The Liberty Bay's voyage data recorder preserved everything: GPS coordinates at 1-second intervals, engine commands, rudder positions, radio transmissions, bridge audio. The data was unambiguous. At interception, the Liberty Bay was 17.3 nautical miles from the Venezuelan coast, well beyond the 12-mile territorial limit recognized under international law. The Mariscal Sucre's logs told their story: radar tracks, communications with Fleet Command, helm orders. They showed a vessel operating under orders to enforce boundaries beyond recognized limits, and a captain who escalated from challenge to physical force in under 8 minutes. Satellite tracking from commercial services and military reconnaissance confirmed both vessels' positions throughout the encounter. The Liberty Bay maintained consistent course toward her declared destination. The Mariscal Sucre diverted from patrol to intercept. Witness accounts from crew on both vessels aligned with technical data. The collision was not accidental in the sense of equipment failure or navigation error. It was the direct result of a decision to use physical force to compel compliance with an order that had no legal foundation in that location. International maritime lawyers reviewed the case within 72 hours. Their assessment was unanimous. The Liberty Bay operated lawfully in international waters with full right of innocent passage. The Mariscal Sucre's attempt to force boarding constituted unlawful interference with freedom of navigation. The use of vessel contact as enforcement violated multiple provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Venezuela's initial response emphasized sovereignty and resource protection. But as evidence mounted and international pressure increased, the position became unsustainable. The coordinates were undisputed. The legal framework was clear. The deaths were real. The conclusion was uncomfortable but unavoidable. A warship operating under flawed orders had used excessive force against a civilian vessel in lawful activity, resulting in fatalities and significant damage. The consequences: 3 American workers who left Trinidad for routine offshore rotation never came home. Their families in Houston, Oklahoma, and California planned funerals instead of welcome home dinners. 14 injured workers faced surgeries, rehabilitation, and uncertain futures. One lost partial use of his left arm from nerve damage. Another required months of physical therapy for spinal injuries. Beyond physical wounds, 42 people carried psychological scars from violence they never anticipated. The Liberty Bay required 4 months in a Trinidad shipyard. Damage extended beyond the visible breach structural members throughout the starboard side needed replacement. Final repair cost exceeded $8 million. The Mariscal Sucre spent 6 weeks undergoing bow reconstruction. But institutional damage ran deeper. The incident triggered reviews of rules of engagement, officer training, and command authority throughout the Venezuelan Navy. The warship's captain was relieved of command. He was not prosecuted. His actions had been consistent with guidance received, but his career ended. Several officers in the chain of command faced administrative consequences for issuing orders that prioritized political messaging over maritime law. Venezuelan Naval Command revised enforcement protocols. Vessels in international waters beyond the 12-mile limit could not be subject to forced boarding without clear evidence of illegal activity. Proximity to platforms alone was insufficient cause. Vessel contact tactics were suspended entirely. The United States Coast Guard and Navy implemented enhanced protection measures for commercial vessels in contested waters. New procedures included real-time position sharing with command centers and guidelines for when vessels should divert rather than assert passage rights through confrontation. The International Maritime Organization convened emergency sessions on naval rules of engagement. Resulting recommendations emphasized proportionality, verification before enforcement, and absolute prohibition of vessel collision as a compliance tool. Insurance underwriters and oil service companies revised risk assessments. Vessels transiting near Venezuela required enhanced precautions, an explicit understanding that legal right of passage did not guarantee safe passage. Some routes were quietly abandoned. Legal firms filed wrongful death suits. Diplomatic channels filled with formal protests. The offshore industry faced questions from workers about safety guarantees that could not honestly be given. For families who buried Torres, Brennan, and Chen, these reforms offered no comfort. They were the minimum debt owed to prevent the next miscalculation, the next decision that valued assertion over human life. The lesson: the sea does not recognize sovereignty. Steel does not acknowledge jurisdiction. Physics operates without regard to flags or legal arguments. Two ships occupied the same water with incompatible frameworks. Venezuela saw territorial integrity requiring aggressive defense. The United States saw international law guaranteeing freedom of navigation. Both positions had merit in principle. Both failed catastrophically in practice. Two captains believed they were right, and the other would yield. One followed orders prioritizing sovereignty over safety. One stood on legal ground that provided no physical protection. Neither blinked. 3 men died for the distinction between 17 miles and 12. The collision was not an accident. It was policy implemented beyond its legal boundaries, judgment that failed under pressure, and physics that could not be negotiated. Maps show lines. But momentum does not stop at borders drawn on charts. What remains are 3 names, 14 injured workers, millions in damage, and a question that echoes across every disputed water in the world. When does defending principle become indistinguishable from causing harm? If you found this video gripping, eye-opening, or worth the conversation it sparks, don't leave just yet. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Hit that like button to support deep dive journalism, and subscribe so you never miss the next story that cuts through noise and tells you what really happened.